A submarine surfaces in total darkness off the coast of southern Spain, close enough to shore that the crew can see faint lights from a fishing village, and two officers on deck slide a body wrapped in a life jacket into the cold Atlantic water, watching it drift toward the beach with a locked briefcase chained to its wrist. Nobody on that submarine knows this man's real name. Nobody ever will, outside a small circle of British intelligence officers. But within days, that single body will convince Adolf Hitler to move entire divisions of his army to the wrong country, and it will help save the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers who never even know they were protected by a corpse. These files were sealed for a reason. Some, for 50 years. Tonight, they're open. What if I told you that one of the most consequential deceptions of the Second World War wasn't carried out by a spy, a soldier, or a secret agent at all, but by a dead man who couldn't lie, couldn't be interrogated, and couldn't ever break under pressure? By the end of this video you'll understand why Operation Mincemeat remains one of the most audacious intelligence operations ever executed, and why it worked so completely that Hitler's own high command staked the defense of an entire coastline on a lie written by two British officers. Before we start, tell me in the comments, if you were tasked with inventing a person from nothing, a full identity convincing enough to fool the most feared intelligence services in Europe, what's the one detail you think would matter most? By early 1943, Allied planners had a problem that seemed almost impossible to solve. After driving German and Italian forces out of North Africa, the obvious next target for an Allied invasion of southern Europe was Sicily, a large island close enough to North African bases to be supported by air power, and strategically positioned as a gateway into mainland Italy. The problem was that this was obvious to everyone, including the German High Command. Winston Churchill himself is said to have remarked that anyone who wasn't a fool would know Sicily was the target, and that was exactly the danger. If Hitler concentrated his forces on defending Sicily, an Allied invasion could turn into a bloodbath, with tens of thousands of soldiers landing directly into heavily fortified positions. British intelligence needed the Germans to believe the real invasion was going somewhere else entirely, and simple radio deception or minor misdirection wasn't going to be enough to move an army as large and well-informed as Germany's. The idea that emerged came from two officers working inside British naval intelligence, Ewan Montagu and Charles Chumley, who had been developing unconventional deception concepts for the better part of a year. Montagu was a barrister in civilian life, methodical and precise, the kind of man who instinctively understood how a skeptical mind picks apart a story looking for the one detail that doesn't fit. Chumley was younger, more imaginative, willing to propose ideas that sounded almost ridiculous the first time anyone heard them. Together they formed an unlikely partnership inside a small, obscure section of British intelligence that had spent months studying a previous, failed attempt at body-based deception, learning from those mistakes, and refining a method careful enough that it might actually survive contact with professional German scrutiny. Their plan was almost absurd on paper. They would obtain a corpse, dress it as a British officer, plant fabricated documents suggesting that the real Allied invasion targets were Greece and Sardinia rather than Sicily, and arrange for that body to wash ashore in neutral Spain, a country officially uninvolved in the war but known to have close, informal cooperation between local officials and German intelligence operatives. If Spanish authorities found the documents and passed them, even secretly, to the Germans, the deception would carry a weight that no forged radio signal or planted rumor ever could, because the Germans would believe they had stumbled onto real secret intelligence rather than being deliberately fed a story. Finding the body was itself a delicate and morbid problem, one the officers approached with a strange mixture of clinical planning and quiet respect. They needed the corpse of a man who had died in a way that would be consistent with drowning at sea, someone without close family who might ask uncomfortable questions, and someone whose body could pass a cursory Spanish autopsy without revealing the true cause of death. This search took months, involving quiet conversations with coroners and hospital officials who could be trusted to understand the sensitivity of the request without ever being told the full purpose behind it. Montagu later wrote, in the sanitized account he was eventually permitted to publish, that the entire process felt uncomfortably close to grave robbery, and that both officers were acutely aware they were making decisions about a dead man's body and his family's grief without that family's knowledge or consent, a moral weight that stayed with them long after the operation succeeded. They eventually used the body of a homeless Welshman named Glynndwr Michael, who had died after ingesting rat poison, producing symptoms in his lungs that a coroner might plausibly mistake for the effects of drowning. His real identity was kept secret for decades after the war, and even now, most people who know this story only by its cover version have never heard his actual name. Building the false identity around this body became an extraordinary act of narrative construction. The officers invented a man named Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, and then set about making him feel real down to the smallest detail, because they understood that German intelligence analysts were trained specifically to look for the kind of small inconsistencies that expose a fake. Major Martin was given a wallet stuffed with the ordinary debris of a real life. Theatre ticket stubs from a night out in London. A bill from a London hotel. An angry letter from his bank about an overdraft, the kind of mundane detail no forger would think to include unless the person was real. Photographs and love letters from a fictional fiancée the officers named Pam, written with genuine tenderness so that anyone reading them would believe they were reading a real man's private life rather than a prop. They even placed a receipt for an engagement ring, adding a small, human, almost tragic layer to a man who was about to be presented to the world as recently deceased. Every object was chosen deliberately, and every object served the same purpose, convincing anyone who searched this body that Major Martin had been a living, breathing officer just days earlier, not a fabricated identity built around the body of a stranger. Chained to his wrist was the true weapon of the entire operation, a locked briefcase containing a letter from one senior British general to another, discussing invasion planning in a tone that read as genuinely candid and slightly indiscreet, exactly the kind of document that feels authentic because it wasn't obviously designed to be found. The letter referred to sensitive discussions of upcoming operations, and while it never stated outright that Sicily was a diversion, it strongly implied that the primary Allied targets were Greece and Sardinia, with any activity near Sicily intended only as a feint to distract German attention from the real invasion. The entire deception depended on Major Martin's body being discovered by the right people, examined just enough for the documents to be copied or read, and then returned in a way that wouldn't raise Spanish or German suspicion that the whole event had been staged. On the 30th of April, 1943, the submarine HMS Seraph surfaced off the coast of Huelva in southern Spain and released Major William Martin's body into the water, close enough to shore that ocean currents would carry it toward the beach within hours. A local fisherman discovered the body the following morning, and Spanish authorities, officially neutral but unofficially sympathetic to German interests in many quarters, took custody of the remains along with the briefcase. Exactly as British intelligence had hoped, word of the discovery, and of the sensitive documents attached to it, reached German intelligence officers operating inside Spain within days. The documents were secretly copied, photographed, and forwarded through diplomatic channels to Berlin, all while Spanish officials maintained the outward appearance of a routine, respectful handling of a drowned Allied officer's body, eventually returning it to British authorities for burial with full military honors. A final touch of authenticity that helped ensure no one on the Spanish or German side ever seriously questioned what they had found. Back in London, Montague and Chumley now faced the hardest part of the entire operation, the part that required no cleverness at all, only nerves, waiting. There was no way to know immediately whether the deception had worked. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, reading intercepted German communications through the Enigma decryption program, became the only real window into whether Berlin had taken the bait, and for days afterward, intelligence officers combed through decrypted German signals traffic searching for any sign that the documents had been noticed, copied, or dismissed as an obvious plant. Every day without confirmation was a day of genuine uncertainty about whether thousands of soldiers were about to storm beaches that Germany had correctly identified as the true target all along. In Berlin, the documents landed on the desks of German intelligence analysts who had every reason to be skeptical of unexplained windfalls landing conveniently in their laps, and yet the sheer weight of corroborating detail, the personal letters, the financial troubles, the engagement ring receipt, the entirely plausible chain of custody through a neutral country, overwhelmed their doubts. The documents were ultimately reviewed by Alexis von Wren, the head of the Abwehr's Foreign Armies West Department and one of the most respected intelligence analysts in the German military, a man whose professional judgment carried enormous weight precisely because he was known as rigorous and difficult to fool. Von Wren certified the documents as authentic, and that single assessment, from a man whose reputation for skepticism should have made him the deception's greatest threat, became instead its strongest endorsement. Some historians have speculated that Von Wren, who was later executed for his involvement in the July 1944 plot against Hitler, may have had his own quiet reasons for wanting the German war effort to fail, though the evidence for this remains debated, and most agree the deception itself was simply built well enough to survive honest scrutiny on its own merits. Whatever his motivations, his certification made its way up the chain of command until it reached Adolf Hitler himself. Believing he now held secret insight into Allied invasion plans, Hitler ordered a significant reinforcement of German defenses in Greece and Sardinia, redirecting resources away from Sicily at precisely the moment Allied forces were preparing to land there. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of Germany's most capable commanders, was dispatched toward the Greek theater in anticipation of an invasion that would never come. German panzer divisions that could have dramatically strengthened Sicily's defenses instead sat waiting in the wrong country, guarding beaches that Allied forces had never intended to touch. On the 10th of July, 1943, Operation Husky began, and more than 160,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Sicily, supported by roughly 3,000 ships and thousands of aircraft in what was, at the time, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. German and Italian defenses, weakened by weeks of misdirected reinforcement, could not mount the kind of overwhelming resistance that planners had once feared. The island fell to Allied forces within roughly 5 weeks, opening the path toward mainland Italy and the eventual collapse of Mussolini's government, all while thousands of German troops sat uselessly in Greece, waiting for an invasion built entirely out of theater tickets, a fabricated fiancé, and the body of a man whose real name the Germans never learned. Historians studying the campaign afterward concluded that the deception likely saved thousands of Allied lives that would otherwise have been lost storming beaches defended by the full weight of German armor, and it remains one of the clearest examples in military history of an entire strategic outcome being shaped not by superior firepower, but by a story told well enough to be believed by the people most trained to doubt it. The full details of Operation Mincemeat stayed classified for years after the war, with only a heavily sanitized version reaching the public in the 1950s through a book written by Ewan Montague himself, one of the operation's original architects, who left out the identity of the real body and many of the operation's more delicate details, and who was only permitted by British intelligence to publish anything at all because enough time had passed that the sensitive tradecraft involved was considered safe to reveal. That sanitized version became a bestseller and later a feature film called The Man Who Never Was, released in 1956, introducing millions of people to a softened version of a story whose full truth remained locked away for decades longer. It would take until the early 2000s for historians and researchers, working through newly released government files, to uncover the true identity of the man whose body had been used, a homeless Welshman with no family to object and no way to ever know that his death would be repurposed to help decide the outcome of an invasion involving well over 160,000 soldiers. Modern estimates suggest the diversion of German forces to Greece and Sardinia, including at least one full panzer division and a significant portion of Axis naval strength in the Mediterranean, meaningfully reduced the resistance Allied troops faced landing on Sicily, translating directly into American, British, and Canadian lives that were never lost storming beaches the Germans had correctly identified as the real target before a single fabricated love letter changed their minds. Every fake letter, every planted receipt, every carefully worded detail in a stranger's coat pocket had been engineered by officers who understood something that modern deception experts still study today, that the most convincing lies are rarely the boldest ones, but the ones built from small, mundane, deeply human details that no one would think to fabricate. The success of Operation Mincemeat did not end with the fall of Sicily. Allied planners studying the operation afterward recognized that they had stumbled onto something bigger than a single clever trick, a repeatable set of principles about how to build a lie an enemy would trust more than the truth, and those lessons were folded directly into the far larger deception campaign that would precede the invasion of Normandy the following year. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate effort to convince German intelligence that the main Allied landing would come at Calais rather than the beaches of Normandy, drew heavily on the same core insight Montague and Chumley had proven in the waters off Huelva, that skilled intelligence analysts are not fooled by grand, sweeping claims but by the accumulation of small, boring, Internally consistent details that no fabricator would think worth inventing. In that sense, the corpse of an unknown Welshman, quietly deposited off the coast of Spain, helped shape not just one battle but the deception doctrine that would go on to help protect one of the most consequential invasions in human history barely a year later. So, what do you think? Was Operation Mincemeat the most brilliant deception of the entire Second World War, or do you know another operation that deserves that title? Let me know in the comments below, and if stories like this one, real declassified operations where intelligence and imagination outmaneuvered one of history's most dangerous regimes, are the kind of thing you want more of, make sure to subscribe to Spy Tales, leave a like, and turn on notifications, because there are a lot more classified files waiting to be opened.